My son Clark was always a quiet boy. He never talked much. But the day he brought Mia home, his eyes spoke for him. They were bright. They were full. I knew, even before he said a word, that this was the woman he would marry. I liked Mia from the very first moment. She was warm. She was real. She did not try to impress me with big words or a perfect smile. She just sat down at my kitchen table, wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and said, "Something smells amazing in here." That was enough for me. I knew she was the one. We talked for a long time that first evening. At some point, we found out we carried the same wound. Both of us had lost our mothers to cancer. Both of us were in our 20s when it happened. There is a kind of pain that cannot be explained. It lives in the quiet moments, in a birthday without a phone call, in a wedding without your mother's hand to hold. When Mia told me her story, her voice became small and soft. I reached across the table and held her hand. I did not say anything. I did not need to. From that night, I thought of her as mine. When Clark proposed, my husband Robert and I made a decision together. We said, we will give them the wedding they deserve. And we did. We paid for everything. The venue was a beautiful garden in Virginia, green and wide with white flowers on every table. The dress was exactly what Mia had shown me on her phone, months before Clark even bought the ring. I remembered. I saved the picture. When the day came, I handed her a small envelope. Inside was the name of the bridal shop and a note that said, "Go get it. It's already paid for." She cried. I cried. We both laughed at each other for crying. The honeymoon was 10 days in Italy. Robert and I chose a small hotel on the Amalfi Coast, the kind of place with lemon trees outside the window and the sea below. I wanted them to begin their life together with a beautiful memory, something they would talk about when they were old. I had only one rule for myself: do not interfere. I made this rule before the wedding, and I kept it like a promise. I never dropped by without calling first. I did not give advice unless they asked. I did not ask when they would have children. I did not compare Mia to anyone. I did not bring the past into their home. I gave them space, real space, the kind that says, "I trust you." My only tradition was Sunday dinner. Every week, I cooked. I always made their favorites. Mia loved my roasted chicken with garlic and rosemary, and Clark never said no to his grandmother's pasta. We sat together, ate slowly, and talked about small things: life, work, a funny thing that happened during the week. Nothing important. Everything important. On their birthdays, I gave $50 in a card, always handwritten. I never gave money without words. My friends, I will be honest, were not all so welcoming. Some of them came to me with quiet warnings. "Be careful," one said. "You don't really know her." Another told me she seemed too comfortable too fast. I did not listen. I told them they were wrong. I defended Mia the way I would defend my own daughter, with certainty, with love, without hesitation. Because that is what she was to me, my daughter, the one I had always wanted. Those first years were the sweetest of my life as a mother-in-law. Sunday dinners, long hugs at the door, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the house, Mia's laugh from the living room. I did not know then that something was already changing beneath the surface. I did not know that the warmth I felt was not the whole story. I cannot tell you the exact day it changed. There was no fight, no loud moment, no door slammed. It came slowly, the way cold comes in winter, not all at once, but little by little, until one morning you realize you are shivering and you do not know when it started. It was after 2 years of marriage. Clark called me one evening. His voice was different, careful, like someone walking on ice. "Mom," he said, "Mia and I want to talk to you. We feel like you don't respect our boundaries." I held the phone and said nothing for a moment. "Boundaries," I repeated. The word felt strange in my mouth. They told me I asked too many questions. They told me I made them feel pressured. They said my calls were too frequent, my interest too much, my love, though they did not use that word, too heavy. I sat with this for a long time after we hung up. I thought about what I had asked them. How was your week? Did you eat well? How's work going? These were my crimes. Kind questions, normal questions. The questions any mother asks because she loves her child and wants to know he is alive and well and not suffering alone somewhere. I did not understand. I still do not, fully. But I said I was sorry. I pulled back even more. I called less. I waited to be invited. I swallowed my questions like pills and tried to be smaller. And then I got sick. It started with one seizure, then another. My body began doing things I could not control, could not predict, could not stop. I could not drive. For 2 years, I could not sit behind a wheel. My world became very small. My house, my bedroom, my couch. Robert drove me to my appointments. I depended on him for everything. The depression came too. It did not knock. It simply moved in and made itself at home. Heavy and gray, it sat on my chest every morning when I opened my eyes. Some days I could not get up. Some days I could not explain to anyone, not even to myself, what was wrong. Nothing was wrong with the world. Everything was wrong inside me. I was frightened. I was exhausted. I was not myself. I had doctors. I had prescriptions. I had a list of medications that helped me function, helped me sleep, helped me climb back slowly towards something that felt like living. And then Clark and Mia told me they thought I was addicted to my pills. I remember the moment so clearly, the way the air left the room, the way my hands went cold. Me, a pill addict. What they did not know, what I had never needed to explain before, because I had never been accused before, was that I was terrified of addiction, more than most people. I had watched it destroy someone I loved when I was young. I had carried that fear my whole life. My medication was kept in a small, locked safe in my bedroom. I counted every tablet. I followed every instruction. I called my doctor before I ever changed a dose. I offered to show them. I said, "Come to my house. I will open the safe. You can see everything. You can count them with me." They said no. They did not want the truth. They had already decided on the story. That was the part that broke something in me. Not the accusation itself, though it hurt like nothing I can describe. It was the refusal, the closed door, the fact that I was lying sick and frightened in my own home, and the people I had given everything to would not even look at the evidence. I was at my lowest. I could not drive. I could not always think clearly. I could not fight or explain or defend myself with full strength, and they chose that moment, that exact moment, to believe the worst about me. Isolation is a quiet thing. It does not always look like cruelty from the outside. Sometimes it looks like unanswered calls. Sometimes it looks like a Sunday dinner that nobody comes to. Sometimes it looks like your son's voice becoming polite and distant, the way people speak to someone they are no longer sure they know. I cooked the roasted chicken some Sundays still. Robert and I ate it together, just the two of us. The table felt very large. I had defended her to my friends. I had said, "You are wrong about her." I sat alone in my quiet house and thought about that. I thought about it for a long time. The letters came on an ordinary morning. There was no warning, no phone call before, no gentle preparation. Just two envelopes in my mailbox, side by side, like two stones placed carefully on a grave. I stood at the door and read them. I will not repeat what they said. Some words, once you write them down again, do more damage. What I will tell you is this. They accused me of things I never did, things I never thought, things so far from my nature that I had to read the sentences twice, 3 times, 4 times. Not because I did not understand the words, but because I could not understand how anyone who knew me could believe them. I sat down on the floor, right there in the hallway, still in my coat, and I cried for 3 weeks. Not quietly, not with dignity. I cried the way you cry when something inside you tears, deep and ugly and without end. Robert did not know what to do with me. He held me when I let him. He left the room when I needed to fall apart alone. My sisters called every day. My friends came and sat with me and said almost nothing, because what is there to say? They were all shocked, every one of them. These were the people who had watched me, who had seen me cook Sunday dinners and defend Mia to anyone who doubted her, who had watched me pay for a wedding and write a honeymoon into existence and show up, always show up, with $50 and a handwritten card and a pot of rosemary chicken on the stove. "We know you," my sister said. "We were there. We saw everything." But Clark was not there anymore, not really. And slowly, through the fog of those weeks, something became clear to me. I thought about Mia, about the years, about the way things had moved, so gradually, so carefully, until my son was somewhere I could not reach him. I thought about her studies in psychology, about the words she used, always the right clinical words: boundaries, trauma, toxic, triggered, words that sounded like understanding, but worked like walls. I thought about how every time I had come close to Clark, something had shifted. A new concern, a new accusation, a new reason to pull back. 10 years. It had been 10 years since she first sat at my kitchen table. 10 years of slow, patient, invisible work. I am not a fool. I am a mother, and mothers eventually see. Then my heart began to fail. The doctors gave it a name: broken heart syndrome. I almost wanted to laugh when they told me, except I had no laughter left. It is a real thing, a medical, measurable thing, where grief and stress do to your heart what years of hard living cannot. The muscle weakens, the rhythm stutters. The body says what the mouth has been too careful to say. This is too much. This is simply too much. I have a procedure this Friday. They will go in and try to fix what has broken. I am not afraid of Friday. I have made my peace with whatever comes. What I cannot make peace with is leaving without saying what needs to be said. So I wrote him a letter, Clark has not spoken to me in 8 months. 8 months of silence from my own child, the boy I held in a hospital room before he had a name, the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, the boy's favorite pasta I still know by heart. I wrote to him anyway. I told him I love him, that I miss him, that there is not a morning I wake up and do not think of him first, the way mothers do, quietly, instinctively, like breathing. I told him I forgive him. Not because what happened was small. It was not small. It broke my health. It broke my sleep. It broke something structural inside my chest that surgeons now need tools to repair. I forgave him because he is my son. Because forgiveness is not a reward I give to people who deserve it. It is a thing I carry for myself, so the weight does not finish what the grief already started. I told him, whenever you are ready, I am here. No conditions, no list of things he must first admit or apologize for. Just here, the way I have always been. People have asked me how I do it, how I keep the door open after everything. I tell them, I am not a fool. I know what happened. I know who moved the pieces and how long it took. I know my son is somewhere inside all of this, behind years of careful words and slow separation. Still the boy who fell asleep on my shoulder. I know he has been told a story about me that is not true. And I know that one day, maybe not soon, maybe not before Friday, maybe not for a long time, something will shift. A quiet moment, a memory at the wrong time of night, the smell of rosemary from someone else's kitchen, and he will remember who his mother was. Unconditional love does not mean you feel no pain. It does not mean you are broken by what was done to you. It means that even broken, even on a hospital bed the night before someone opens your chest, you still reach toward your child. It means the love was never about what you received in return. It was about who you are. I am a mother. My heart is failing, and still it is full of him. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing I know how to be. Clark, if you ever read this, I love you. I am waiting, and I am not going anywhere.